I am Daniela from Rattlestick, and we are co-hosting this panel with the Soul Project and have been dreaming about this panel for months. Almost around the same time that we decided to program Mimi Madre, Arturo was talking about wanting to be in dialogue with Roger, and just being able to really talk about what solo performance is about. And that is what this is. We are fearlessly guided by Jose Solís, a friend, an amazing artist and critic, someone who has been a wonderful champion of Mimi Madre. And I will say that his energy and spirit behind Mimi Madre he was talking about this piece way before anyone else was, and that is contagious. Now we all are. And if you haven't seen the show yet, it runs now and extended until the 25th. So see it again, tell your mother, tell your grandmother, tell your friends, and all that jazz. So I'm going to turn this over to Jose, and thank you all very much for being here.
Thank you, Daniela. And it's a pleasure to be in conversation with you, Roger and Arturo. And I want to start by asking something that I've always been very curious about, especially since the two of you not only perform your plays, but also you write your plays. And going to see a solo performance, for me in the audience, usually feels like we are in direct conversation with you on stage. And I wonder if for you, when you're writing the piece, are you kind of having a conversation with the characters that you're going to portray at some point? Or how does that happen? Like, what does that process feel like in a way that us mortals not on stage can understand?
Please, Roger, go ahead, start. I feel like I feel like in your presence, I'm still learning, which is beautiful.
I am in your presence and I am learning. And I have learned that I am in the presence of an extraordinarily talented gentleman who is working as a writer and as a performer and as a shaman of sorts. You are there right now. You're going to be in front of a live audience, right? In just a little while after this conversation. You are in that sacred empty space and you are listening. This is what struck me about your work, that you are not just soliloquizing, but you are also listening to those very deep spirits, whether they're in Brazil or Ecuador or transatlantically in Nigeria, perhaps, the folks who bequeathed to us the legend of Yemaya. This is great work, and thank you so much for inviting me to be in conversation with you. I'm honored. Jose, I think that we are always, if we're doing what we're supposed to be doing, we're always listening. We're always in communication with not just the people who we're playing on stage, but all of the people who know the people that we're playing on stage. We have to create an entire world, an imagined world, and believe in it so that our intended audience can believe in it as well. That's a brief answer, but it's a big and important question.
You know, I want to just say, Roger, it is like, I want to just tell a quick story, an anecdote, because to be in conversation with you is such an honor and such, like, I'm not gonna lie, I got a little nervous when they said we were gonna have this conversation, because I was 21, 22 years old, and I was in my solo performance class in undergrad, and I knew that I liked solo performance. I knew that it was something that I was interested in, but I hadn't seen the like extent of solo performances that exist in the world yet. I was still a young artist. And my teacher busts out a Huey P. Newton story and he puts it on TV. And my mind was blown in that moment. And it was in that moment that I realized that that was what I wanted to do. And it was just because like your heart, your generosity, your spirit. I mean, talking about like being a shaman, I felt like through the screen, which is I think kind of ironic that you experienced this show through the screen as well, is it's the first way I encountered your work, was I felt so deeply attached to you in that journey. And it was one of the most brilliant performances I've ever seen. And it really inspired me and influenced me as a young artist at 20 years old, 21 years old. And I aspired to work at that level that you had sort of like put out there. And I said, okay, I want to do something like that. So it is such an incredible honor to be able to sit here and have this conversation with you. And in many ways feels full circle 15 years later, you know? So yeah, I mean, I didn't learn, I learned about, you know, I learned about you and your work from that performance. I learned about Huey P. Newton to that performance. And I, you know, since then had taught it in classes and shared it with my youth and my students at what is possible, I felt like as an artist and as an actor and as a writer, I was like showing this is what's possible. And when you talk about conversation, you know, Jose, when you ask about conversation with an audience, I remember watching Huey P. Newton and it felt like you were just talking to an audience. And it wasn't until years later that I realized, and maybe you can confirm this for me or not, is that every night was different and every night you improvised some of it and every night, you know, and to me, that was like, that when I found out that that was what you were doing, it blew my mind even more because I was like, you are so in tune with the spirit of not only Huey, but like in tune with the spirit of all the ancestors that you're able to be on stage every night and be that free and be that generous. And I felt like I aspired to that, you know? And so to say that, Ni Mi Madre, Jose, you know, I never wrote it. I never sat down to write Ni Mi Madre. I never sat down and said, I'm gonna write this play. Instead, I put on a dress and I stood in front of a live audience and I started to improvise it. And I started to like become the character and let the character move me in conversation with the audience. So the creation of Ni Mi Madre was a conversation. It was me sparring with my partner, which happened to be the audience. And so they were throwing balls and I was throwing balls back. And that's how I wrote Ni Mi Madre. And so at the end of every performance, I transcribed it and then taking all of that, started to edit and craft it until it became this thing. And there's still moments when I'm on stage today where I have to remind myself, Arturo, this came from the body and this came from conversation. So do that, you know, like in the performance, do that. And I got to say that, Roger, that really, you inspired me to work in a way that like that, you know.
Good. I hope you stay inspired, especially this evening.
Yeah.
I don't envy you having to talk about the work and then let that conversation go and then go on and do the work. But you know, sometimes it's like that.
Yeah.
I really detest pre-show conversations. I would rather be somewhere else. But this is the way that you're doing it, and you're doing it very courageously.
Thank you.
So I'm sure you'll be able to, you know, dust it off and move forward this evening with what you need to do. I work in a variety of ways, sometimes improvised, sometimes not, sometimes scripted, sometimes not, sometimes a combination of things. Sometimes I do a series of improvisations, which then eventually become scripted. With a Huey P. Newton story, for example, it was never written, it was never scripted. I never wrote it down until we actually documented it in the film that you saw. My good brother, Mark Anthony Thompson, who does the wonderful sound design for Huey and for a lot of my work, described it as a song cycle in which we sing the same songs every night, but we switch it up. And I think that I'm always trying to catch up with the great musicians, with the great musical tradition, particularly the jazz artists who have mastered this thing called improvisation, who start off with a head and then will free form and then go back to that head and tell the same story, but in a different way, each playing of a composition or of an improvisation, which is a composition in progress, I suppose you could call it. I think that I've learned more listening to jazz, perhaps, and reggae than I have in any acting or writing workshop. And I aspire to what has been achieved, particularly, by people like Charles Mingus and Branford Marsalis, Louis Armstrong, people who will play April in Paris 10 different ways in a weekend, in different sets. So that's where I think that I get a lot of my inspiration.
Thank you. So, excuse me, if because I don't know this either, like if there is a safety, so to speak, in being part of an ensemble and not being on your own in front of a camera or in front of an audience, what inspires the two of you to take that leap and be on your own? Where does that instinct come from?
Well, I think it's a psychiatric disorder from which we probably both, suffer. And this is probably the only way of, remedying that very serious mental condition. There's this lovely moment, Arturo, and kudos to the design in collaborators, where you open that thing upstage center and there's a mirror there. And we see not only you and you, of course, as La Madre, but we see the audience as well. And you can't see that on camera, but we see this. We see the audience reflected through you and looking at you. And there are these multiple reflections of experience. And that's a really special thing, which speaks to, of course, the vanity which you're playing there. But it also speaks to the grand theatrical experience of reflection and illumination. And sometimes we don't use it in a design sense. Sometimes that has to be imagined and created with absolutely nothing. There's a moment in a Huey P. Newton story in the filming of it where Huey says to the audience who was there was a live audience, that he loves them. And someone in the audience shouts back, "And we love you too." And then another voice says, "And we miss you." And in that moment, which of course was not scripted, it was clear that we as an audience, as a collective body of people, were suspending any kind of real-time, commitment, and going where imaginatively, politically, Huey took us. The spirit of Huey took us, because in that moment, it was not Roger playing Huey. It was Huey in the room, and that was a good thing and a frightening thing, and always a challenging thing.
And that's what I have to say, Roger, is one of those things that like moved me so deeply, was that, about Huey, was that the line, like, I just believed that you were Huey, I just believed it, it didn't feel like you playing Huey ever to me. It always felt like the spirit of Huey was right there, and you were the vessel capturing it and moving through it, and the audience was moved by it. And I definitely think you're right. We must have some sort of psychological condition to be like, I'm going to put myself on stage every night and put myself through this. And I think what's powerful about it is, like, it's when you can get out of the way and just be the vessel, and then it sort of isn't you up there, it's sort of somebody else moving through you. And I think about that, like, I could talk about, why solo performance versus your play. And I think that it's just, this is what this story demanded. It demanded this, and I find it like, I just find it like there's something, I love listening to people talk. And I really love, like, the stories people will tell about themselves, and those they won't say, but they're telling about themselves anyway, through their body or what they're not saying, I like sitting, like, I would sit with my grandparents a lot and listen to them. And there's something beautiful about one remembering their life versus seeing them live every moment of it. There's something beautiful about the way older people sit with you, and they'll tell you about their childhood, and they'll tell you about, their first love and the time, all these things, and or parent died, and all those moments that exist. And there's something amazing about them telling you versus us seeing them do all those things. And I feel like that, to me, is what I like about solo performance, because that is a solo performance ultimately, right? It's like your grandparent is confessing all these stories to them, and you're watching them relive it right in front of you. And so that, to me, is like, when I become Becci in this play, it feels like that. It feels like I'm watching the world pass in front of her, the way if she would do it at a dinner, telling all of her friends, and I feel like, so I don't know what it is, but there's something to me that really captures my heart when I watch someone just talk about their life and remember and reflect, and I get to build the world around it. I get to imagine that world versus it being like, played out for me, which is really beautiful. Yeah.
I'm glad you brought that up, Arturo, because one of the things that I love so much about your piece that also makes me very sad is that I think about how many times I told myself, one day I'm going to sit down in front of my grandmother and I'm going to tape her, and I'm going to be able to say these stories, and that way make sure I don't forget them. And in many ways, what the two of you do is that you're able to extend the life of your ancestors and preserve them. And I wonder if you can talk a little bit about in which ways this does help turn them into immortal beings in a way, because they're literally always alive, because you're extending their lifetimes and continue to build on them. And also in that way, also make sure that you never forget them.
Well, I think that it's an extension not only of a personal life, but it's also the extension of a time, of a history, of a conundrum, as it were. One of the signature points in your piece, Arturo, is that of colorism, and the idea of Africa always being just below the surface, whether it's in the culture of Ecuador or Brazil, of course, and how you are linked multi-generationally through this tremendously vibrant and essential culture of Yamaya, the goddess of the sea, who makes an appearance not just in Brazil, but in Puerto Rico, in the Dominican, in Cuba, in Haiti, wherever Yoruba people have wound up, Charleston, South Carolina, there is going to be a Yamaya. And this is more than just the reflective ongoing existence of one individual. We're talking about an entire nation of people, an entire universe of people, an entire universe of history, which can be played out in these little sequential moments, which are not just happy moments or moments of pageantry. They can be those very sad moments where one's happiness, one's self-commitment is determined by the color of one's skin or the color of one's eyes. And this is, right, the colonial imperative, which plays itself all out in Ecuador, in Brazil, in Honduras, in Belize, wherever Africa has, clashed with, indigenous and European cultures.
Yeah, that's one thing that I'm very, I'm curious about as, being a Latino artist, is that, I often say is that I feel like within our Latinidad, we haven't reckoned with ourselves yet in many ways, and especially when it comes to race and colorism, and, and we haven't reckoned with it. And that's one thing that I feel like, I'm curious as an artist, especially in this piece, is talking about. And, I don't know, I feel like, I'm still navigating what it being an artist means and what the job of an artist is. But one thing that I feel like I do, or I try to do, is to just reflect, is reflect back. Reflect back. This is what it is. And this is reflecting. This is the problems, and this is how we reflect, back. And not try to solve everything, but like reflect back. This exists and we need to talk about it. This exists and we need to reckon with it. And Roger, you mentioned that is because I've seen 3 of your shows now, and one thing I that sort of is true in all 3 of them. I saw Frederick Douglass. Now I saw the Huey P. Newton story, and I saw your newest one on Otto Frank, and I saw it via Zoom and everything else, and I'm always moved by the moments where you break time period, right? Whereas time sort of bends, where is that the present is the past, is the future, is the present, is the past, is the future. And that sort of cycle of like, this repetition. We're talking about, the Nazis in Germany, and we're talking about Otto Frank, and then we're talking about immigration on the border, and we're talking about, this cycle of this systemic cycle. It still exists, it's past, it's present, it's future. And I think that to Jose's point is, is this about sort of preserving? I don't know if it's about preserving so much as it's about, or is about how do we, capture the ancestors. It's all there. It's past, present, future. It's time bends in a way in theater. You know, it's not linear. It sort of like goes all over. And I think that that is what I like about solo performance or about theater in general, is that, you know, it is all of, it's this all here, you know, the future, the present, and the past are all in this moment. And I think I wonder about that actually, Roger, a lot in your work is, you know, because you're tackling these historic figures, you know, Frederick Douglass and you know, Otto Frank, and, you know, I'm often wonders like, when, I mean, you're talking a little bit about improvising in jazz and everything else. It's like, when those moments come from you, like what, you know, when you're tackling a historic figure, you know, how much reading do you do, and how much do you feel beholden to the text that may have existed, or to the life or the facts that may have been? And when do you start to riff and go into jazz and start talking about other things that relate back to the core or the essence of that person? Yeah.
I think that there are different ways of approaching it, Arturo. With Douglass, the body of the piece is largely in Frederick Douglass's own words and is largely in chronological order. But then I bookended it with original composition, with a prologue and a hip hop epilogue. With Otto Frank, you know, it's an epic poem, if you will, imagined in the voice of Otto Frank, who speaks to his daughter impossibly, beyond her era and beyond his own era as well, even though he lived a very long and productive life. He was the only survivor of his immediate family in the Nazi death camps, and he lived into his 90s, actually. And he was, of course, the preserver of his daughter's remarkable diary, which actually, in its empty form, was a gift from him to her for her 13th birthday. So there are a variety of ways of engaging history and biography and the current dilemma, you know, of president, for example, the US president who would go to the Mexican border and see the installation of barbed wire and say to us in a public address that there's nothing more beautiful than barbed wire when used properly. And if anyone has any kind of historical orientation, if anyone knows anything of Auschwitz or of Manzanar, which was a camp here in California in which thousands of Japanese American people were locked down. If anyone has any sense of that history, then they would be absolutely offended and outraged and perhaps motivated to hear that from a sitting US president. So I think that we have our work cut out for us as artists, but we have our work cut out for us as citizens as well.
Thank you both. In about 13 minutes, we're going to open up the conversation for your questions. So feel free to enter your questions in the chat, and we'll get to that in a little bit. I want to talk to the two of you about something that really fascinates me. And like, since you've been talking about there almost being this sense of being possessed by your characters, when there have been gaps and, you know, like years sometimes in between you coming back to a solo performance that you've done in the past, do you find that getting back into the skin of those characters has become part of your muscle memory and part of who you are? Or do you still have to work and find, you know, a different process to re-enter those bodies and spirits?
Oh, absolutely. I was just in Martha's Vineyard last month doing Frederick Douglass Now in a very beautiful place called the Tabernacle, which was a place where Frederick Douglass himself had spoken in 1876. And I had not stood on stage since December of 2019. And when I got up on stage, you know, last month, it felt like I hadn't been up there since 1876 myself. So you talk about muscle memory. Well, you talk about muscle deterioration as well. It it takes great physical stamina to do this work, but it takes great mental acuity as well, and to bring it back out of Zoom land and to try to nail it in front of a live audience is a great challenge. And as the world goes, it's not the greatest challenge. There are certainly people who are facing far greater and more severe challenges than me trying to pull off Frederick Douglass. But it's what I do, and it's what I have done, and what I certainly hope to continue doing to make a contribution, not simply as a historian, as a performer, as a writer, but as I said, as a citizen. Paul Robeson said that we have to elect to fight for freedom or for slavery, and that he had made his choice because he had no alternative.
That's beautiful. Yeah, I mean, I feel the same. I feel the same. Coming back to the theater, I call them my COVID cakes, like I definitely, got softer during the pandemic and I don't, and muscularly too, just like trying to run a show for an hour long that's full of all this stuff. It takes a lot of energy, and to get ready for it, it was biking or walking more and running more and breathing while doing it, and sometimes walking and going through my vocal trills so that my body and my voice stay healthy and are able to carry the show. Yeah, it definitely, I feel like the character is, inspired by my mother, and I've been studying her my whole life. So I feel like I can drop into her and have been dropping into her since I was a kid. So I feel like in that regard, I have an advantage of knowing this woman personally. But, there's a difference between the real her and then the places that I take her in the play, or the places she takes me in the play, I shall say. And those are the moments when, riding that, that emotional stamina as well, being open of the heart and of the spirit. And there are days when you're like, oh, I don't know if I don't know how much my heart can take today. And so you have to find ways to protect yourself, as well, at the same time as staying open and doing the thing. You can't shut off, because then there's no engagement, right? But you find ways to sort of protect yourself at a ritual of protection, so that way you can do it again and again and again, and for that length of time without compromising the integrity of the work. And so that's sort of like, finding the ritual in to her every night, and then not finding the ritual out, and I find that, making that space is important, doing my warm up is really important, so that my body, my mind, my spirit are aligned before I walk out on stage. So that way I know what I'm in for. And I'm not going, on a long ass road trip with no water, so I think about that. It is interesting to come back to the theater after being away for so long during the pandemic, and I will say it was exhilarating to get back into the theater and to rehearse. There's nothing like that feeling of walking into a space and standing on the stage and being like, in a month from now, we will fill this with bodies. But for now, it's ours, and we get to craft the magic we get to share. And coming back to it was like, okay, cool. It's like running the marathon. You got to start preparing yourself for it.
May I
This is
say,
me.
I'm
Go
sorry.
ahead, Rod.
No, I was just going to say that, Arturo, your play is as much ritual as it is play. And that the form of absorbing pain, of absorbing loss, of absorbing confusion and conflict is all woven into this ritualistic process. And you have found a way in, you have found a way through, and God bless, you will continue to find a way out. And there you are. You've literally stripped down and absorbed, not just a singular lived life, but a series of lives which matter.
Thank you.
You're talking about ritual. I wonder for the two of you, whether your childhood or when you were, in the process of becoming artists and studying and all of that, where did you find these rituals? Like, were they necessarily religious or spiritual events, or did you find the same feeling and in so many ways, you're both like non-denominational preachers, like leading all of us into like a place where we can meet spirit. So where were those places for you growing up and even today?
I'll say that, like, it's interesting. I don't know, I've done theater my whole life. It's like, I feel like in so many ways I was raised in the theater. I don't come from, a theatrical family by any means. I mean, I come from a quite theatrical family, but not one that is a practicing theatrical family, but I remember, like, I've been doing, so I would almost say that, like, the theater for me is in many ways a church, right? It's like my church, right? It's where I go to understand the world, and where I go to reflect, and where I go to sort of pray, in a sense, like, or to connect with the ancestors. And I think about that a lot. I remember, this is just a small story, is that, I remember when I must have been in high school or middle school or something. And, my dad and I were talking, and we were talking about life or people and choices. And I just remember reflecting it back to my acting training. And I was like, oh, I get that, Dad. Yeah, that makes sense. Because when you're on stage, da, 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 and the character, da, da, da. And I, like, broke down what he was saying through theater. And I guess that's a moment when, I realized is that my understanding of the world, or how I related to other people, or how I understood relationships, or how people do things, relates back to theater. And I think that my theater training, or in my investigation of theater, or the ritual of theater, right, has allowed me to understand people better, right, or to understand lives better. And it's like basic acting, right? It comes down to sometimes basic acting, and sometimes I want to, like, share that with people. It's like, y'all, if we can just look at the given circumstances for a second, and just look at them as facts of given circumstances. These are the given circumstances of the text. So if this is what are the given circumstances of the text, you can maybe understand that that person is making that choice because of their given circumstances. And I feel like in life, we don't do that. We put so much, oh, but this and this and this and this and this and this and this, and like, it's emotion, it's an anger, and it's like, and sometimes I have to break it down for myself, or sometimes I have to break it down for my parents, or for family or friends, and that's like, let's just look at the given circumstances for a second, and then you can denote why certain choices are made. And if you can understand why those certain choices are made, and then it means you can empathize with them, on that person, a little bit. And I feel like when I think about religions, you know, they talk about empathy and they talk about compassion and they talk about making choices. And I feel like that's what you do in theater, right? You empathize, you make choices, you evaluate given circumstances, and so that way you can understand life better, you know? It might sound really basic, but I feel like I feel like if I were to understand at an early age when I was understanding my parents or understanding why people made choices, I always related it back to like theater or training or my acting training. And that was sort of my way of understanding them, you know, and I feel like in Mi Madre is like, you know, in order to understand my mother, I wrote a play about her, you know, it's like, so I feel like, you know, I don't know, I feel like very much a child of the theater at my core. Yeah.
I would have to acknowledge both the sacred, having grown up going to Catholic school and surviving that, and also the profane. I also grew up listening to Richard Pryor and my father's old Red Fox Blue albums and memorizing those as probably the first soliloquies that I had committed to memory. I also listened to a lot of AM radio, and there was a DJ named the Wolfman, and he came on really late at night on XERB on Tijuana, from Tijuana, because he was profane and he couldn't, you know, get an FCC license in the US. So he was broadcasting from south of the border. And he would say, "Man, are you naked? Are you naked? Put your boogaloo on the radio, man." And, you know, this was just the most amazing thought that someone was in a studio asking hundreds of thousands of people if they were naked. And, you know, as a child, I had to respond in some way. And I tried desperately to call the Wolfman and to let him know that I enjoyed his show, but no, I'm not naked, Wolfman. I'm not. Is that okay? And so, you know, those are the things that really, I think, you know, pushed me into this strange world of solo performance.
Thank you. And we have some questions for the from the audience, but before we get there, I was like really mind blown, Roger, to realize that the Hugh Newton story was shot 20 years ago. And in so many ways, you were so ahead of everyone, because it was only until last year when people in the theater community and the industry really started talking and worrying more about preserving performance and also in making performance available to people who are not capable of being geographically in the same place where you're performing. So can the two of you, because also like Arturo, like I got to see Mi Madre because you stream it. So that was like wonderful. Like I was in my living room, like thousands of miles away. And I also felt like I was part of the audience in the actual theater. So can you talk a little bit about in which ways, if at all, the pandemic and this new world that we were thrown into changed or affected, you know, that need that you as artists have to make sure that your message, you know, travels and is received hopefully by as many people as possible?
You know, I did Rodney King, and we taped it at the East River Amphitheater in New York. And it's still streaming on Netflix. And it's great on Netflix because you can push a button and you can get subtitles in 42 different languages. So you can see, you know, the gospel according to Rodney King, as I call it, and translate it in that way. And look at our conversation right now. You know, Jose, you're in Honduras. Arturo, you're in New York getting ready to go on stage. I'm in LA in Echo Park. And we're able to have this conversation and to share it with people, you know, all over the world, whoever can tune in. And we'll continue to tune in on, we're doing Facebook, right? Or, yeah. So YouTube. We'll be able to continue to speak to folks, and folks will continue to be able to contribute to this conversation through the comments and what have you. I think there's some people out there right now, in fact, who might have some questions. We have about 10 minutes left.
I echo everything Roger said. It's nice to have family all around the world be able to tune in, you know, and catch subtitles with the show, you know. So I think that that's really important. But we can move on to some questions.
We have a question from Juan Ramirez Jr., who is asking, if needed, how do you know what material to cut and what to keep? Is there such a thing as killing too many of your darlings?
That's an interesting question. This is like what I love working with a team, right? So it's like, you know, I have my director and I have my dramaturg, and that you have, you know, the designers, and I will say that, you know, I credit them with as much of this show as anyone else, because we really work collaboratively and as a team, and trying to understand what is the arc of the story, right? And so I think that one way to test it, if you're looking for like a quick suggestion, is if you're questioning it, take it out. If the story still stands without it, I don't think you needed it, you know. And if you really are passionate about that thing and you want to keep it, then find where it fits and where it can work, you know, so that way you don't lose it, but it continues to keep the story of the thing flowing. Now, that's just sort of like dramaturgically, you know, there's other ways of talking about that. Is there such a thing as killing too many of your darlings? I mean, you don't want to kill the play. So it's like, you know, find the things you need and find the things you don't, and be willing to let go of some of those things. Because you don't know, you might surprise yourself. You might find something else that's better than that thing that you don't want to cut.
When I first did Frederick Douglass, it was called An Evening with Frederick Douglass, and it was far too long, An Evening with Frederick Douglass. My own mother, who is hanging with your mom right now, said, son, you need to cut, you need to edit. So, you know, when your own mother is telling you, you need to edit, you need to edit. So my advice would be always listen to your mother.
I think that's related to something that Elizabeth wants to know. And Elizabeth is asking, how do you rely on others as witnesses to help you communicate your work?
Well, I've been very fortunate to have been in longtime collaboration with Mark Anthony Thompson, who's a great composer, singer-songwriter. And before we did a Huey P. Newton story, we had an idea of what we wanted to do sonically. We had, put some beats together in his studio. And we had an idea of what we wanted to do design-wise. We knew we wanted to use that chair. But in terms of the text, well, you know, I had literally been cutting and pasting stuff left and right. And one night before we had to be on stage in San Francisco, in front of Huey's, family and friends, comrades, lots of enemies, I'm sure, as well, he just started asking me questions. Tell me about Bob Dylan. Tell me about the blues. Tell me about the Panther 10-point party platform. Tell me about your father. Tell me about your mother. And I answered all of those questions as Huey. We didn't record it. And I went back to my notes and was astonished that I had answered those questions basically verbatim, because I had dug in so deeply into the archives, which sometimes I do. Other times I don't. But Huey was definitely an archival journey, which took months and months and months. With Rodney King, nah. Rodney King expired Father's Day 2012, and I was on stage by the first week of August improvising a piece about him, which I thought was going to be just a kind of memorial piece. But this thing called America happened and continued to happen. So Rodney King, for better or for worse, mostly for worse, continued to be relevant.
Aletta Mascoro is asking for Arturo, what advice would you offer to queer trans folks entering the field who are interested in this kind of work?
I would say, first of all, I just invite you to do it, right? Like, I think that is something that I you are like, do it, right? And there's like, come into the field and do it and tell your stories and be bold and courageous enough to tell them. And I feel like that, I started to write because I wasn't seeing my family reflected in the American theater. I wasn't seeing queer Latino roles in the American theater. I wasn't seeing, stories that I wanted to see told, or I wanted to be a part of told in the American theater. And so I started to write. That was sort of like my call, was like, okay, I'm going to start writing, because if we're not talking about this, someone needs to talk about, I'm gonna start talking about it. I want to start talking about it. And then the process of it was healing for myself. And I realized it was healing for other people. And, I think that if you are called to tell your stories in this medium, then honor that. And this medium isn't for everybody, right? I have friends who like, I don't do solo performance. I don't want to do it. It's not my thing. And I think I knew it was my thing. I was like, oh, I like this thing, and I feel like, honor that. If you have it and it's bubbling up inside of you, then do it. And I would say, like, for me, it was an improvisation. It was putting on the dress and becoming my mother that opened up the doorway. I tried writing this play from my perspective and it failed wildly. And it wasn't until I put on the dress and became my mother that it took off, and it jumped off the page, and I realized it was in the body. So I invite you to like be bold to try, if it's not working through the pen, to try something else, but to not give up on telling the story. Maybe it's just figuring out which way you're going to enter it. It could be with the pen, it could be through the body, it could be through visuals, right? It could be an entire painting piece that then you find out text, but generate, generate, and then edit later. Find the editing later. Like Roger said, ask your mom, she'll let you know if it's too long. My mother has also given me notes. She has called me and given me notes. But yeah.
So we have 3 minutes left. Thank you to everyone who submitted their questions. And I have a short question for the two of you. Since the pieces that you write and perform are obviously so personal, if there ever came an opportunity for another actor to continue the lives of your plays, like, who would you dream of seeing, Roger playing your Frederick, or your Huey, or your Rodney? And for you, Arturo, who would you want to see playing you and playing your mother and this women in your life?
Well, it's hard to say. I am the father of 2 daughters and 2 sons. 3 of my children are still juveniles. and they might be interested in following this journey, and they might not. That is their choice. But certainly, I think that in doing this work, one would want the work continued by someone who has been inspired by the work and who has a certain investment in it. Hal Holbrook was a great solo performer who did for many years Mark Twain. And when I was a child, I was exposed to Holbrook's Twain and continue to be exposed to Holbrook's Twain. And in fact, I took my elder daughter to see him not that many years ago. And he was still doing his Twain, which he had been doing since the 1950s when he was an undergraduate. So we never know, how what we do is going to inspire someone, whether that someone is related to us or not. We can only hope to share the same spirit that has been shared with us.
Yeah, I don't know. That's a good question. I do hope that one day someone else does perform it. It is always, since I would love to show up to the theater and sit in the audience and watch this play. I think that would be really exciting. And I've always said that. I've always been like, one day it would be really interesting to sit down and receive the play. And I had the great fortune while we were workshopping this play, my team of Danilo Gambini, the director, Nahuel Teleria, the dramaturg, and Stephanie Machado, the assistant director. There are three brilliant minds, three brilliant artists, and this play would not exist without them. And Stephanie Machado, we originally invited to the workshop so that she can act the play, so that I can just be the playwright for a moment, and I can hear the play, so that I can hear it and then figure out where I want to edit it. And listening to her read the play me, play my mother, play my grandmother, and do the whole thing was fascinating. And I learned so much from listening to her play it. And it lives in her body in a very different way than it lives in mine. I happen to be, I'm born, I'm cisgendered man. And for her, she's a cisgender woman. And for her as a woman to tell the story opened up a whole bunch of different doorways than for me, And so I'm really curious to see, a plethora of people. I'd be really curious to see trans actors tackle this on, or to see other queer actors, or to see female actors tackle this and work on it. And, my question, Danilo, the director, and I were sitting down the other day and we were asking ourselves, well, if someone else were to play this, what would the final ritual be? Because the final ritual is Arturo doing it. So it brings back the question of what is the ritual if someone else does it? And then I wonder if it is the ritual of theater, how do we align those things? So, how do we align it then, So I don't know, it's an interesting question. I'm open to the problem, and I'm curious to see what that journey would be like. And for now, it seems very apparent it's in my body. But I don't know, as a playwright, there's a part of me that always wants to be able to give the gift to another actor. Yeah.
Roger and Arturo, thank you so much for your work, and thank you to Rattlestick for hosting this incredible conversation. Subscribe to everything that Rattlestick sends out and does. They have more incredible programming coming up at some point. So thank you everyone for joining us, and break a leg tonight, Arturo.
Thank you, and thank you so much, Roger. Thank you so much for having us here.
Continued success.
Thank you. Same to you. I hope to finally get to see you in person on stage.
It'll happen, knock on wood. All right.
Yes. Yeah. Good night.
Thank you.